Okay, who can believe it? That actually, having now looked at the whole of Bereshit since Simchat Torah, feels like, and in some ways it feels like a long time ago, and in some ways it feels like it was just yesterday. That here we are, we're now finishing the book of Bereshit. There are so many themes contained in Bereshit. We're going from the beginning of civilization until the Jewish people have become Bnei Israel. They're actually now a fledgling nation after 5 generations. There are many, many themes to cover through the whole book, but of course we've got with Zoom attention these days, there's even perhaps less time than in a normal frontal shiur. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at 3 key themes of Bereshit that I think you see through pretty much every narrative and every generation, with such timeless messages that in some ways it's so uncanny. We're living in such different times, and yet it's these very same issues that seem to always be the things that either get us down or give us exhilaration in our lives. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to pick a few key texts where we see these trends repeating and contrasting with each other. But I think that if you go away afterwards and you plug it into pretty much any parasha of Bereshit or any story, you'll suddenly notice the same themes, or at least I hope so. So the first theme, I'm going to just name the themes, then we're going to try and explore them through the actual text themselves. The first, of course, is that of communication. Communication and the lack of in Bereshit is so, it's such a present theme, whether it's parents not speaking to their children, parents over speaking to their children, siblings not communicating with each other. And again, we're living in an era today where we have so many means of communication and we are so blessed in that sense. And yet so often it's actually what's missing in so many of our key areas of our lives. Second of all is that of family relationships. And within that, we have so much, whether it's sibling rivalry, parents and children, active parenting versus passive parenting, fertility and fertility struggles, and legacy. And what does that mean? What does it mean to take on a legacy? Is it about doing things the same way? Is it about changing the path that was given to us? And the third theme is that of the faith system that we see at the end of Bereshit, that where we start off the book with just a black hole and God creating the world, what does it look like to be a human being in the universe who believes in God at the end of Bereshit? What is that path of monotheism that has been innovated and also sustained and now becomes the heart of what it means to be the Jewish people? So, if all of that sounds okay, what I'm going to do is to share screen. I'd like to start off by looking at the story. Well, if we're going to look at the first episode of sibling rivalry, that's going to take us to Cain and Abel. Can everybody see the screen? Okay, so here we have this story. This is, of course, post being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. By the way, one of the things that's really interesting in this story is that we do not hear of Adam and Eve at all. By the way, we never really hear of Adam and Eve speaking to these children at all. There's no communication, and they are certainly absent from the entire story here. And when we pick up, we see how, of course, we have Abel, who is the shepherd, and we have Cain, who is the farmer. They both give offerings to God, and Abel's offering is heeded too, but Cain's is not, and Cain becomes very jealous. Now, as a reader, we say to ourselves, wouldn't we also feel a little bit slighted if your brother's offering got divinely accepted and yours didn't? Wasn't Cain, you know, a little bit, there was almost validity in him feeling down? Let's pick up together. Would somebody like to read for us in the English from verse 6? You can just unmute yourself. Don't all shout at once.
And the Lord doing it.
And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you distressed? And why is your face fallen?"
Yes, go on.
I'm keeping going. Excellent. "Surely, if you do right, There is uplift, but if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master. Cain said to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain came upon his brother Abel and killed him.
Thank you very much. Let's pause there for a moment, if we may. What we see over here is there's this build-up that Cain was clearly upset. God even comes and intervenes and says to him, why are you upset? And then is when the climax happens, the tragedy happens, the first murder that we see in the Bible happens. And this phrase, as was beautifully read for us now, reads as a fragment. Cain said to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, the sentence doesn't flow. So the question is over here, what did he say to him? Did he say something that was so provocative? Was this the beginning of the rift? And why does the Torah not tell us what he said? So there are many different opinions here. There's that of Rashi who says it wasn't that he said anything particular. He was so jealous of him that he went out picking a fight, just venting, angry. So therefore, there wasn't anything specific for the Torah to record because it was just anger. But the other way to perceive it is that actually, and this is from the Sforno in the 15th century Italy, is that actually this didn't all happen on one day. And Cain said to his brother, this was a kind of an anger, a resentment that built up over time. And the ... that you see has been put into the English translation is essentially time passing. They never had a proper conversation. They never really had it out. As a result, what happened? That anger festered, built up until one day they're in the field and Cain kills Abel. So, of course, this sets for us a powerful message about communication, or the lack of, which is, had they actually had it out earlier, would it have ended in murder? Did the end of this story have to be that way? And so we clearly see here, first of all, we see a Cain who there isn't the communication. And that blame doesn't just go on to Cain. That can also, one could say, well, why didn't Abel, instigate and say, are you upset with me? Let's discuss this, let's have it out. But rather it was just something that they never managed to really get to the bottom of it. It remained sort of a low level anger conversation, speaking at each other. And that's why it escalated in this way. The second of our themes is the fact that, number one, the first parents in the world, we have the beginning of the story where it says how Eve managed to conceive again. These were her children, but the parents are totally absent from the story. The brothers themselves, the fact that we have this introduction about the jealousy, the one being the shepherd, the other being the farmer, and yet the lack of self-esteem, even when God intervenes and says to Cain, why are you upset? He still can't live with himself. The lack of ability to accept the other with different talents, with different personality. And the third part of the story, our third theme, which we said is to do with faith, is what actually follows next. So I'm going to share again. Sorry to share and to not share. I just like to be able to see people's faces properly in the meantime. Of course, the next line, we have the very, very famous phrase, which is when suddenly the voice of God reappears in the story and says, where is your brother Abel? And Cain's answer, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Hashomer achi anochi? Now, we generally see this question as a rhetorical question. Am I my brother's keeper? Why should I know? But actually, a fascinating reinterpretation of the story is that this is a genuine question. This is the beginning of civilization. People don't know what it is to be a family. They don't know what it is to care for somebody else. Cain felt threatened, and so he killed. Is there something wrong with that? That there wasn't an innate sense that murder is wrong. There wasn't an innate sense of looking out for somebody else. Being my brother's keeper was not obvious to Cain. And so then the response comes from God, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Let's right click on this story for a moment and let's try to plug it in to some of our other stories that we see in Bereshit. Let's now go theme by theme. Let's start with the theme of communication. Now, by the way, if we go back one generation from Cain and Abel to Adam and Eve, they're fascinating because actually we see very little communication between them. And after the episode of the tree and eating the fruit, we see no communication between them. Except even when she has these children, they obviously did go back to having an intimate relationship. She calls out to God and says, God has given me these children. We don't see any dialogue. How did the whole mistake happen? It came from a miscommunication that God had said to them, do not eat from the tree. But when she spoke to the snake, she said, God has said to us, don't touch the tree. Huh? Oh, it was a lizard, not a snake. But of course, that's because the snakes then had legs and went on all fours. And part of their punishment from God afterwards was that they would go on, they would slither like snakes and their legs got cut off. Anyhow, so therefore we see how miscommunication actually comes in right at the very beginning, that with Adam and Eve, when she says to the snake, we're not allowed to touch the tree, the Midrash says, you know what happened then? The snake pushed her against the tree and nothing happened. And then the snake said, well, look, nothing happened to you. It will be fine. And then, of course, she went off to Adam, etc. And part of this is, when people start adding on to the law, and they do, everyone's stricter than the next person, you actually learn from Adam and Eve that it's not good to do that. The law is the law. Just stick to the law. You don't need to add things on, because generally when you start being overly strict, it ends in disaster, just like it did then with the first human beings. But what's interesting is, once again, that first mistake came from not a lack of communication, but it certainly wasn't total truth. And it might have been a totally innocent mistake that she made, but that's where it came from. Then we get to Cain and Abel, where we see that, again, according to the Sforno, they never had the conversation. Then we take it forward a couple of generations. Let's fast forward to one of the most difficult episodes that a parent had to face in their life with their child, which is that of the binding of Isaac. Abraham's told, take your child, the child that you waited so long for, the child that you love, take him to the mountain and you're going to offer him up to me there. And we have this very poignant moment where the two of them have been walking along with an entourage. They've got servants with them who are carrying their things. And Abraham now turns to the servants and he says to the servants, leave us here. And at this point, we see something very interesting in the narrative. I am sharing with you again. Everybody see that? Can you see over here, just for time, where I've underlined it? Abraham takes the things from the servants, and it says, "V'yelchu shnehem yachdav," the two of them walk together. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here's the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" This is the difficult moment. This is where Abraham is going to have to decide whether he actually shares with Isaac what's happening, whether he actually shares his son's own mortality, that he thinks, he might not be there by the end of the day. What is he going to answer to this question? And Abraham said, "God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son." And then it repeats, and it says, "And the two of them walked on together." And the question is, why would it repeat? The two of them walked together, and then later, the two of them walked together. And what was so poignant about this conversation? Anybody? Well, I'll jump into the vacuum of silence. They start going together. It's a physical going together. And then Isaac turns to his father and he says, "Listen, we've got all the stuff with us, but what about the actual offering?" Now, a surface glance read of it, we say, okay, God will provide. But if you read it again, and you re-punctuate it, he says, God will provide the offering, my son. What's he saying? God will provide the offering. It's you, my son. And therefore, actually what happened was that in this difficult moment, Abraham has two choices. Either he can sugarcoat, he can pretend that nothing's happening, it's all zen, they're going on a lovely walk together, God will provide, don't worry about it, and he's fobbing him off. Or, as Rashi encourages us to understand the text, Abraham wasn't fobbing him off. He was actually confronting the real issue. When we look at the story of Cain and Abel, yes, that was between siblings, but it comes to the same thing when it's parents and children. And generally what what I'm finding out is that often you think that you can sugarcoat and hide something from your child and that you're protecting them, but actually they often sense that there is something, or they'll find out from somewhere else and in a harsher way. And the best thing that we can do is that at that most difficult moment was that Abraham opened a channel of conversation. And that's why it repeats, V'yelchu shnehem yachdav, and the two of them went together, because now they weren't just going physically together where the one parent knew what was happening and had all the heaviness of the situation on his shoulders. The two of them went together, both in body and also in mind and in spirit. And they went together on this mission together. We might travel through difficult things in life, but when we're traveling with people, it's so much easier. And sometimes we want to protect those people around us and we don't let them in. But often, as this story seems to show us, when we do let them in, the journey is that much easier for everybody involved. Now, we see this in another very interesting way, of course, in the next generation, where suddenly we once again have a lack of communication. We have Isaac, the same Isaac whose father spoke to him at the binding of Isaac, and his wife Rebecca. And they need to give a blessing to their children. And they think about this very differently. Isaac wants to split the blessing between his children. He wants them to work together. He'll give Esau the birthright, which was essentially a physical blessing about the prosperity of the land. And ultimately, Esau was the hunter. He was the one who knew the land. What did Jacob know about farming? He sat indoors all day reading his books and learning. So Isaac says, yes, Esau's got some flaws, but you know what? If they're harnessed, if he works together with Jacob, we'll have a good team. Rebecca says no. If the one party is rotten, he can't provide. If Jacob is challenged to have to go out and have to hunt, if he has to go and fight in the army, he'll be able to rise to the challenge. He'll be able to do both. They see it differently. The question is, why does the Torah not once mention to us that they had a conversation? It never says it. It just says it came to the time that Isaac wanted to bless his children. And suddenly we see Rebecca going behind his back and deceiving. Now, it could be that they had sat up very late and they had been discussing and they had had, many cups of tea and they had agreed to disagree. And so Rebecca knew there was no choice. Of course, Rebecca had had the prophecy in her pregnancy where God had told her that Jacob was going to be the one to lead. Did she never share that with Isaac? We're not told. It's left for us to speculate, and everybody will see the story slightly differently. What I would like to pick up on is a nuance in the text that, to be honest, I've only really paid attention to actually this Bereshit, reading it closely, which contrasts with the lack of deception that is going to happen in the next generation. And I'm going to share screen once again. And this is what happens at the moment where this whole lack of communication is really at its most, which is the core of the deception. As Jacob, who's been set up by his mother to come in dressed as Esau, approaches his father, you've got that feeling of total deceit. And the text really lets you into that you almost feel like you're watching it. If you were watching a movie of this happening, you kind of feel, that suspense and that feeling of he's getting closer. Is this going to be picked up? What's going to happen now? And the way that the words that are used, the whole pace slows down and we're suddenly let in to something very interesting. So have a look over here. Can everybody see that? Would somebody like to read for us?
Okay, I'll read.
Thank you.
From the beginning?
Yes, Isaac said to Jacob.
Isaac said to Jacob, "Come closer that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob drew close to his father Isaac, who felt him and wondered. The voice is the voice of Jacob, yet the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau, and so he blessed him. He asked, "Are you really my son Esau?" And when he said, "I am," he said, "Serve me, and let me eat of my son's game, that I may give you my innermost blessing." So he served him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come close and kiss me, my son."
Okay, so thank you for bringing that to life for us. So here we have this scenario where clearly there is a suspicion that maybe this isn't Jacob. Maybe there isn't total truth here. Now, it's specifically in the Hebrew brought out, but I don't know if you noticed the phrase that repeats, this come closer, and we're sort of saying, oh, is he going to get, is he going to get, and then he feels him, and then he says, is this really you? Now, if you look in the Hebrew, on the Hebrew side, you can see I've underlined it. The word geshana, he says to him, come close to me. And then Jacob, can you see the next underlined word? Vayigash Yaakov, Jacob came close. Now, normally, the Hebrew word we use for coming close is karov, right? To come close to somebody. This is not the phrase that it uses here. However, this phrase is familiar to us because a couple of parashiot later, we're going to have a parasha that's named with this root, which is Vayigash, right? Vayigash comes from this same phrase of coming close. This type of coming close is when somebody comes forward to almost present something, to be active in doing something. It's not just a passive coming close. And this is the first time in the Tanakh we see this phrase of come close. We see it only a few times. And so then Yaakov comes close. But this coming close, every time we see it, highlights the deceit, highlights the lack of communication, highlights the fact that Jacob's very careful. He's trying not to lie, but he's also not actually being himself with his father. And each time it then says to us either, and he came close in his deceit, or come close to me. And each time it's emphasizing this. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this word is because we see it one generation later with Jacob's son, Joseph. As I said, we see it the first time with his son, Judah. That Vayigash Yehuda, Vayigash Elav Yehuda, when Joseph is testing his brothers and Judah wants to come and defend them and say, I'm going to give up my life for him, we just need Benjamin back. It's Vayigash Elav Yehuda, Yehuda came close. But then what's interesting is that when Joseph then reveals himself to the brothers, he doesn't want to keep up. Joseph has a really hard time keeping up that sort of, mirage of him being somebody that he's not. We keep seeing, he said, he couldn't hold back anymore. And he says to them, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And his brothers at that point are so bewildered and scared of him that they almost hold back. It's sometimes easy to come close when we don't know the truth. It was easy for Judah to stand in for Benjamin when he didn't know who Joseph was. But suddenly when they know who it is, he takes a step back. And so suddenly we see a repeat of what we saw with Isaac pulling out Jacob's deceit. We see this with Joseph to his brothers in total honesty. Vayomer Yosef el Achav, and Joseph said to his brothers, Geshu na elai, come close to me. Accept me for who I am. Let's put the past behind us. Let's be square with each other. Let's actually have it out. Have that conversation. Vayigashu, and they came close to him. And this is then a word we see repeated a couple more times in the narrative, even though it's not a phrase that we see used that often in the Tanakh. These two contrasting scenes seem to once again hint to us the enormous importance of communication, straight communication. Where Cain and Abel never had that conversation and it ended in disaster, Joseph and his brothers never had that conversation and it ended badly, but they were able to redeem it. And having learned from the past, Joseph was keen to make sure that this time there was going to be a transparency to their relationship. There was going to be an honesty to their relationship. There was going to be clear communication. So we see this huge shift, that the communication from one generation to the next is never the same. There's never one way. Everybody's going to be different, and each generation might be different in the way that they communicate. But lack of communication is generally at the foundation of all disaster. And we see that right from the beginning of time. By the end of Bereshit, we see how suddenly communication has come right into the center of the plot. Now, for our second theme, and then hopefully we'll put all these parts together in a few moments, we spoke about the family relationships, the jealousy between people, the fertility struggles, the different ways that spouses prayed together, and legacy. And over here, I just really want to highlight, because I want to move on to the third theme, a couple of key points, again, that we see through the generations. And that is, that of course we saw from Cain and Abel, that what was highlighted to us from the very beginning, the one's the farmer, the other is the shepherd. And there seemed to be this lack of ability to accept the other for who they were. We see the same thing with Rachel and Leah, that Rachel is the wife who just wants to be the mother. Leah is the mother who just wants to be the wife. And each of them becomes so miserable. I mean, to the point that Rachel, having had watched her sister have 4 children, is eaten up with, devastation, and comes to her husband asking for support. And we're going to have a look at this in a second. And he says to her, what am I instead of God, that I should bring you children? But the words of the verse are very clear, that she was jealous of her sister. And then, of course, we flick forward another generation when we get to Joseph and his brothers. And once again, it's the same jealousy. They couldn't stand Joseph. They were very practical people. They were shepherds. And when he comes to see them, their words about him, when they see him in the distance, do you remember how they describe him? They say, Baal ha'chalamot hazeh ba, this dreamer's coming. What they're saying is, he doesn't fit in with us. We're not people who dream. We're people who are dealing with the practicalities of right now. Has the sheep gone away? What do I need to do to tend him? I'm in the here and now. It's like a yad lepeh, hand-to-mouth existence. Suddenly, we've got this brother who's dreaming up these great things. Those don't go together. We have no space for him. And then we get to this week's parasha. And this week's parasha, of course, when Jacob heard Joseph's dreams right in the very beginning, he told him off in front of his brothers. But then there's a 4 words that are added onto the end of the verse. It says, Va'aviv shamar et hadavar. His father guarded it. He wanted to wait and see what would happen to those dreams. What did he think about how the dreamer goes together with the practical shepherds? And I think that we see this come full circle in this week's parasha. We see a weak Jacob who's about to pass away. And of course, the last thing that he does is to call all of his children together to give them a blessing. And what's remarkable about this blessing, which, by the way, has become the prototype for all blessings since then. Of course, we use the blessing that he gave to Ephraim and Manasseh when we bless children on a Friday night, whenever we bless children. But in addition to that, the blessing that he gave to every single child separately. And the Torah could have just said, and Jacob blessed all his children. Instead, every child is spoken to separately. Every child, he speaks about their strengths, about their weaknesses. That same blessing was taken by Moses at the end of his life, and he did a bit of a cut and paste, but also tweaked things because how the nations, the tribes had developed. Joshua took the same blessing. This blessing became a prototype for the Jewish nation. And I think that what it's telling us is it's taking all the jealousy, all the sibling rivalry that existed through Bereshit, and it's actually laying them out. It's saying, 12 siblings, 12 brothers, those are the ones that we're hearing about in this blessing. You know, you imagine what would it have been like around a supper table with all of them? You know, would there have been conversation, fighting, lack of conversation, hostility? But what he does is he manages to give each one of them a persona that he's recognized and celebrates their colors, their strengths. He also recognized their weaknesses, because if you don't know your weaknesses, then how do you know what to work with or what you need to compensate when you build a team? And this for us actually builds a model of what does it mean to be in a family. Bereshit didn't work out quite like we planned. Every single generation had their struggles. And I think that the ultimate message that it's giving us about family, about teams, is there will be struggles. But the key to it is to be able to recognize the strengths, to recognize the weaknesses, and therefore going all the way back to Cain and Abel, suddenly you can accept somebody else. They've got their own colors. They've got their own personality. But that is how we make the complete picture or the complete rainbow. It's by the celebration of the individual and how we come together. Now, briefly for the third theme. Really, a lot of Bereshit doesn't deal with God in a certain way. It's to do with kind of petty family life, the way that we communicate. However, that's also kind of really so much at the heart of what is, you know, the stuff is in the details. And so what our family life is like, what our communication is like, is so important to who we are as human beings. But then we get this third element, and that is faith. Now, we see this as well, of course. Abraham is the one who starts to trailblaze monotheism. And our question with him is going to be, is this going to be something that's actually sustainable? Of course, we get to this week's parsha and we see it's now in the 5th generation. And this is one of our things, again, about, you know, it's not always, it can't be a one generation wonder. Abraham was a very exciting character. Isaac was a lot less exciting, but he was the one who enabled the evolution and enabled the boringness of it. I just made up a word there, you know, of it to be able to therefore be sustained. But if we go back to Abraham, the key time that we really understand what his theology is not when he's having a high conversation with God, but when God comes and decides to share with him that he's going to destroy Sodom. And here I'm going to share this with you again, because of course our question is, why does God decide to share this information with Abraham? And here you see it. The Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Right? Why did he need to tell Abraham? Because they're so chummy? And this is what Rabbi Sachs saw this as a real prototype of what it means to be a human being and to champion human justice. That God invited Abraham in because he wanted him to stand up for the people of Sodom. And of course, that's exactly what happened. He wanted there to be a conversation. He wanted there to be human prayer and human protest against the destruction of any innocent civilians. And if you look in the next source, you see that this is exactly what happened, that Abraham starts to bargain if there are 50 people, if there are 40 people. And then he says the very strong worded speech, far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? For a human being to turn to God and say, Hashafet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, it's almost taking God to task. And yet, Rabbi Sachs would always say that this shows us our job as human beings, that we're not there, that whilst we can accept what God has done and still have faith, our job as human beings is to champion morality within the world. And when we see something that doesn't seem to us fair as human beings, is to call it out, because that's what Abraham did. And God wanted Abraham to do that in order to set a prototype for humanity where all human beings would do that. Now, the sages actually take this even one step further. And then we'll just see another few examples to bring this to a close. Because of course, when God begins with Abraham and Abraham is told, Lech lecha, go for your journey, it never says why God chose Abraham. And the sages bring a beautiful parable to explain why Abraham was different to everybody else. And I think that it touches on the same theme. It's a very famous midrash. Abraham was wandering along and he sees a palace that is burning. And he calls out and he says, "Is there no owner to this palace?" And God says, and the owner of the palace looks out and peeps out and says, "Yes, I am the owner of the palace." And he says, "But the palace is burning." And the voice says, "Well, then let the one who has ignited the flames come and put it out." Of course, this isn't just a story. It's actually a parable. That you've got Abraham, who is the searcher. He's the seeker. He's trying to find truth in the world. And you have this palace, which symbolizes the world. And then you have the owner of the palace, which is God. And then you have the fire. Who has made the fire? What does the fire represent? The fire is all the evil in the world. But the owner of the palace says, "Well, let those who've ignited the fire come and put it out," meaning this is evil that's been caused by human beings. And therefore God is saying human beings need to put out the fire. But that conversation that Abraham has, where he recognizes there is a God, but yet human beings have to be in control of what they do and of championing human justice. This is what we see at the heart of his conversation about Sodom. But we don't only see it with Abraham. We see it on two other occasions. And then we're going to try and tie this together. And actually, we see it in two very different places. Once again, it's a phrase that repeats over two generations in a different way. And the first is a harsh example. It's the example that I already mentioned, which is when Rachel is struggling to conceive. And she comes to Jacob and she needs that shoulder to cry on. And she says to him, "Please bring me children." And here you see it in front of you. Okay, can you see that? She says to him, "Give me children or I shall die," right? And the drama of her words is, really kind of indicates that existential pain that she's saying, if I don't have children, I see no value to my life. Just going back on our second theme, of course, that instead of celebrating what she was given, that she was the beloved wife, she just wanted to be the mother. And Jacob was angry. And he said to her, "Hatachat Elokim anochi? Am I instead of God who has deprived you of children?" Now, there are many that say that here she was saying to him, "Pray for me." Your father Isaac prayed for his wife and then they had children. So why aren't you praying for me? And his answer is very harsh, because what he says is, God's prevented you from having children. I already have children. Leah's just had, 4 children, so I'm okay. But in a sense, that just makes his answer seem even harsher. Where is his support? She just needs a shoulder to cry on. In the mental health world, maybe 20 years ago, we would have seen responses like this, get a grip, pull yourself together. We would never use that language today. Today, it's all about validating people's feelings, listening to them, for them to understand that they're hurt. And even if, what they're saying isn't totally rational, that this is their pain, this is their anxiety. Jacob's response doesn't hint to that. Now, there's only one other place in the entire Tanakh where we see the same phrase used, and that is in this week's parasha with Joseph and his brothers. I'm sorry that I'm jumping generations a lot, but I was, to do Bereshit in a wrap is quite difficult. So I hope that, the stories are familiar. So I hope that it's not too jumpy going through the generations, but in a sense, that's exactly what Bereshit's all about. I want to look at one final example, and then we're going to try and pull it together. This is the only other place where we see the same very strongly worded phrase used, Hatachat Elokim ani, am I instead of God? And this is used in a totally different context. When after Jacob has passed away, Joseph's brothers are suddenly petrified because they think to themselves, maybe Joseph wasn't transparent with us. Maybe he hasn't really forgiven us. Maybe he held back all these years because our dad was alive and he wanted to respect him. Now we're going to see him unleashed. He's going to take retribution. And they're even too scared to come to Joseph themselves. They send a message saying, our father told us before he died that you must forgive us and not take anything out on us. We'll even be your slaves. And Joseph weeps when he hears this. And I'm going to now share the screen one final time. Okay. Joseph said to them, have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for the good. Meaning, actually, Joseph's answer to them isn't saying, oh, I've forgiven you, I love you, it's all okay. He just says, it's not my place to punish you. That's God's role. Am I instead of God? The question is, of course, why does he invoke these same words that his father used a generation earlier? And how does this tie in to our theme? What's the similarity within these two situations? They're very different situations, but it strikes me that it's the same thing. Because in both situations, the individual or individuals who are coming are paralyzed with emotion. Rachel is being totally blinded in her life because of her grief about not being able to have children. The brothers are paralyzed with guilt. And of course, guilt is probably, one of the strongest emotions that inhibits us from moving forward with our lives. One has to obviously process what's happened, but then we need to be able to move on. And I think that's why Joseph weeps, because he realizes after all these years, my brothers are still so eaten up by guilt that they can't move on in their lives. And in both scenarios, therefore, both Jacob and Joseph are trying to lay out that same system that Abraham championed those years before, which is there's the realm of God and there's the realm of human beings. There's the realm of God, which only God can control. And we can feel upset about it, and we can pray about it, and we can let God know we're not happy about it. But ultimately, we can't change those things. Guilt is never going to help us. It's just taking us backwards. It's not taking us forwards. And Jacob, even though perhaps he could have said it in a more sympathetic way, was ultimately saying to Rachel, look at the good you have in your life. I can't control whether you have children. I wish I could. At least I hope that it was in that sort of a spirit that he said it to her, But therefore, that's the realm of God. We can't control it. What we can control, that's where we need to focus our energies. We are partners with God in championing our role as human beings, is to be the people who can put the flames out, who can champion human justice. We can't control whether there is a virus, but we can control how kind we are to people, the social action that we see, the way that we come together as a community, that we reach out. I saw shout out to the Morgans that Sherry Morgan yesterday has started a whole campaign. A nurse reached out for a neighbor from the Royal Free saying how desperate they were for help. And she started a whole campaign and people start coming forward and going to help. These are the things we can control. But equally, there are many, many people who will be paralyzed with the fear, with the anxiety, even sometimes with the guilt that they've carried with them for so many years. Jacob and Joseph's response is actually not new, but it is the legacy that they took from Abraham, which is that we recognize that there is a God who is planning out certain things for us. We're not going to be able to control those things, but we have been empowered to do a lot. I saw one lovely message tonight which said, you read all the messages about how terrible 2020 is going to be and we pray for a better year in 2021. And it said, I'm going to remember 2020 for the incredible human endeavor of being able to find a vaccine, and how many people have worked together to innovate and to finance and to put this all together. And I thought it was such a wonderful spin. And it's these scenes from our parashiyot so many years ago that actually come to mind. We can talk about all the things that are out of our control, or we can put our focus on that which is in our control. When we put all of this together, I just want to highlight one other point, which is the fact that Joseph used the very same phrase that his father had used those years before shows us the power of legacy, that he used the same phrase. He ascribed to the same theology, but he did it differently. Where Jacob was angry with Rachel, and you don't necessarily read sympathy or empathy into his response, and why is maybe a discussion for a different time. When it comes to Joseph, he wept, and his answer to his brothers was full of compassion and assuring them that everything would be good and he would continue to sustain them and nourish them. And this takes the whole question of our family relationship in Bereshit. And what does it mean to pass on from one generation to the next, to another level? It doesn't just mean to continue what somebody else started. It means to take from the past, but also to know when to change it. And so as we bring Bereshit to a close, what we see across all of these generations is that everybody had the ability to dream, not to be stuck in the status quo of the generations with which they lived. But within that dream, they had the flexibility to be able to respond to the realities that they were with. And that's what allowed them to be able to get through, for something to be able to sustain. And of course, similarly, when we see passing something on from one generation to the next, we see how we have two sides. We have our relationship with God, which is deep. It's profound. That's why the sages say that Abraham started Shacharit, Yitzchak started Mincha, Yaakov started Ma'ariv. Their greatest ammunition was their prayer and their faith. And at the same time, they realized that the other side of that was their ability to champion human rights, to champion morality, to put their focus into what they could control. But the second part is the interpersonal part. And by us having the communication and the importance of relationships, families, team building, and all of those petty struggles that run through Bereshit, it actually puts them on an equal level to tell us we can spend all day praying to God. But actually, the real meaning of our lives is in the details. It's in the way we talk to people, and it's in the way we don't talk to people. It's in the way that we celebrate the other, and we build the other, and we join together with the other. And that is the perfect combination that at this point is when Bnei Israel can become a nation to take those values with them. Unfortunately, it will be into the time of slavery, and only after that will they be able to take those values into their freedom. And it strikes me that as we also come to a close on 2020, it's amazing how it's these same values, especially in this very, very intense year, that have got us through. Our deep faith, when we don't have shul to rely on, but rather, in terms of it being in the actual building with the packed shul as we know it, we have our own type of prayer, our own connection, our own faith that's really kept us going through this time. But also the faith in other human beings. We've realized the power of communication, the power of togetherness, the power of just sending a message and what a difference that can make to someone. And the power of that together we can achieve things when we celebrate other strengths and we build each other and we work together. So please God, it will indeed be a healthy and a great 2021.